Hello and welcome back to another SlimDevOps Live. This was originally recorded or streamed or broadcast on Twitch on June the 3rd. So if you're watching this somewhere else and you want to see these live, head on over to twitch.tv/SlimDevOps. And I'm joined by Pieter again. Hello.
Hello, Martin.
How are you?
I'm good. Yeah, excited to be here. Excited that we've had so many special guests on over the past couple of weeks with Marty and Eric joining us last week. So that was pretty exciting. So yeah, it's been good.
Yep, we've those are still in our Twitch cache here. So if you haven't seen those, at the end of this, you might want to take a peek at those. The one with Marty was particularly interesting. Some great insights there about sort of using containers at scale in sort of travel tech industry. I really enjoyed that chat.
Yeah. We're also going to put the transcript from that up on the Slim.AI website. So if people didn't get a chance to see it and you want to read through or pick out some of the choice bits there, that'll be coming. Probably put that up tomorrow. So that'll be good.
So the URL's above my head. So if you head there, you'll find the links to the blog. So when that goes up, you'll be able to find it. And we'll also have the archive version of the video on the YouTube channel as well, and you can find the YouTube channel from that website in the footer of the page above. So hello to those of you that are joining us live. Welcome back. Thanks for stopping by. We're going to run through some practical examples of how to better make your containers production ready today. So Pieter, this really came about because we've done a number of sort of looks at DockerSlim itself. You've done a great example with Python. We've done one with R with Eric, and we've covered some of the basics of how to use DockerSlim. But some of the feedback we've had is that we may be putting the cart before the horse a little bit, in that there are in fact some ways to use some tips and techniques in composing your Dockerfile before you even get to using something like DockerSlim to set yourself up for best practice and better security and build time optimizations and things of that nature. So we're going to run through some of that today.
Yeah. I think it's something that we've heard pretty commonly. We've talked about it in the chat even, as it came up with R, Python. There's a lot of really experienced developers out there who just haven't worked a ton with containers. And when you kind of go through the kind of online tutorials about hey, get started with Node or Python or R, the examples are good. They're good for learning, but they aren't necessarily good for production, right? And so that's something that we really care a lot about, which is, making sure your containers are safe, that they're optimized, that they're, going to be secure, they're going to run well in production. And so we thought we'd take a step back, do a basics article, and then we'll do a more advanced tutorial. So this might be a little kind of primer for people who've worked a lot with containers, but it's good kind of basic security and best practices. And then, future we'll do some of the more advanced techniques around DockerSlim certainly, but Alpine multi-stage builds, distroless or build packs and stuff like that. But for this one, we'll just kind of go over the basics, which is just really improving your Dockerfile and writing a good Dockerfile for production and what you want to look out for as you go through and do that. So,
indeed. Yeah, Monica I see in the chat says it's never a bad thing to start at the beginning. Yeah. So with that, we've posted, I have posted, and Pieter had some editorial input on this article here. Over on dev.to, so my profile's at the bottom of the article there, and this is the first in a series, as Pieter just explained, and we're going to take you through the whole process of going through some basics like this to some more advanced pieces. So if we take a look at this article, as Pieter said, we're starting with the Dockerfile. What can we do with the Dockerfile to do a better job of setting ourselves up for success when we deploy to production? So in this example, we're actually using a really simple Node.js application. This is the app itself. It is literally the hello world of Node.js apps. That's its whole purpose. So it will literally say hello world. So that's the Node.js example. It's kind of irrelevant that is the example we're using. The rest of the reasons for using Node will become apparent because we can cover some other tips and that are translatable to other languages. So in most of the Node examples that you see, you'll see an example like this for your Dockerfile. And what this says is use the latest node that's been published by the Node project, create a working directory, put your app inside that directory, then install the npm dependencies, expose the app on port 3000, and then it uses the cmd to run the app. So invoke the Node interpreter and the application that you've supplied. And this is a fairly common pattern that we see for example get you started Docker files. And it does work, and it's great for local development, but there's a few problems in here when you start taking it into a production environment. So we're just going to run through some of those issues here. So they're sort of ordered by severity. And so this is the first sort of key issue is running as root. So Pieter, I mean, I'm surprised that this is not like a 101 even in the most basic examples of defining a user to run the app under.
Yeah, it's surprising how often we see this, because we look at a lot of container examples. We're using the Slim web portal that we're building and will be in beta pretty soon to just look at a ton of containers, and it always tells us who the user is. And I mean, I don't know, we should do some analysis at some point to see how many of them are actually running as root. But yeah, that's kind of the first key thing to look at is what user is running your container. Yeah.
And indeed, so without specifying a user, root is used. That's the default context with that the application will run under. So in the Node.js base image, it has a user node, and all we've changed in the Dockerfile is just to say run the app as node.
Martin, is it pretty easy to figure out like what user to run as? Like if I'm using Node or if I'm using Python, is there usually a user that's like available for that? How do I know who to run as?
Yeah, I mean, certainly on the Debian and Ubuntu-based distros, there's a user which I think it's www-data by default, which is basically I'm a web application and it's a predefined account. And there's a similar account in the other, RPM-based distributions as well. So that could always be used as a sort of a fallback account if you don't have a user account provided by the language ecosystem that you're basing your application Docker on. So the next thing we notice here is the first line of the Dockerfile says from node, and then it tags latest. So the issue here is as upstream publishes new versions of Node, each time your Docker image is built, for example, as it's going through the CI/CD pipeline, you may suddenly have a flag day moment where a new version of Node suddenly pops up into life in your container. And there's a good chance that either your application or the dependencies that your application uses are not compatible with newer major versions of Node. So one of the best practice here is to pin the version of the base image, in this case the node image that you're going to use. So this is simply changing from node latest to from node, and in this case 16.2.0. Now there's a couple of benefits of doing this. Do you
I
want
was going to say,
cover those?
This is the one that I'm like the most guilty of. So I make those. I won't say it a mistake, but it's good for kind of like learning and development to use latest. And there is a little bit of debate on this one, right? Like, I mean, if you use latest, you're going to get all the latest security patches. You're going to get like all the latest new updates that you get. But if you pin an image, the idea of the Docker container in production, right, is that it's predictable, right? You can always rebuild it and reproduce it the exact same way. So if you use latest, then you're opening up the opportunity that you're not going to be able to do that. And so pinning not just the major version, which is what a lot of people do, but also the minor versions, will help, because even those might change. They might get updates and stuff like that, but you're going to put yourself in the best position.
It's rare, but you can get API and ABI changes in point releases, particularly if they've addressed some kind of behavioral anomaly, and they've had to introduce some kind of breaking change. So yes, best practice, pick your version, pin it, and just referring to our earlier point, Yannick points out in the chat that there is also an account nobody, a nobody user account, and that is also a good default to fall back to instead of root.
No. Cool.
So there is a trade-off decision to be made with pinning a base image version, in that you are not automatically going to receive any security fixes or performance improvements that come via new updates, or you may not. But the trade-off here is you can use tools to do security scanning and other container management in order to better control or have insight to any vulnerabilities that may exist in your container without introducing the unpredictability that comes with build failures, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So the next category is some performance improvements. And this requires a little bit of understanding in terms of how Docker actually composes images, and more importantly, how it caches the layers that comprise that image. So layer 0 in a Docker image is often well, in some cases it's actually an OS, like RHEL or Ubuntu, but in our case it is Node, which I imagine sits on top of one of the distributions. It could be Alpine, I don't know, I haven't looked, but there'll be an operating system under there somewhere. And what you don't want to do is just have that keep changing. So again, this is another advantage of pinning that base image, so that each time your app goes through CI/CD, it isn't needlessly rebuilding on a new base image. Now, some of the commercial Linux vendors will release new base images under the same major minor version that incorporate critical security fixes, and that will trigger a refresh of the base image. So that's something to be mindful of. But application code is more likely to change during the dev cycle, as you iterate on features or refactor code, fix bugs. So dependencies in the core system are installed here by npm. I will show that. It was back up here. So npm is what's responsible for installing the node dependencies that our application requires. So what we're going to change here is to break up the installation of these dependencies into separate instructions. So we have a copy line here, which is to copy the package.json and optionally the lock file in. It then runs npm CI. We'll get to that in just a moment. It then defines the user and then copies in the application. Now, this is interesting because a lot of people will say having multiple copy steps is a bad thing, right?
Yeah. This is one of the counterintuitive ones that as we were working on this article, surprised me was, I was always taught that don't create new layers, right? Like minify the number of layers that you create. But the actual learning here is that you want to think smartly about the layers that you are creating. And since Docker is going to cache the dependencies, and hopefully those aren't changing a ton. Now they may, and then you just rebuild the image. But if you're optimizing for that build time, your application is going to be the thing that's changing all the time. So actually splitting those into 2 layers actually makes a lot of sense in this case. So.
Yeah. So what we end up with in terms of what's being cached, we have the base image here. We then have this step here where the package.json is put into the container, and then here where the npm dependencies are installed. So this is another layer, and this layer could change more frequently because we may introduce new modules that our application requires into the package.json, which would trigger this layer to be rebuilt. And then we have our application that we then copy in, and that creates another layer. And what we also have changed here is we're using npm CI rather than npm install. And I've linked to the upstream documentation on npm CI, which explains why you would use npm CI, and it's really a faster way to install npm dependencies with some better predictability and reliability, specifically when you're in a CI/CD environment. So now we're going to move on and we're going to look at entry point versus CMD. So this was interesting because I didn't understand the nuance of this before, but there's 2 ways you can invoke your application. One is via a CMD, which uses the shell and then calls your app. And then you can define an entry point into your application directly. And the subtlety here is that when you're using an entry point, you get better signal handling, which is likely important to how your application reports exit status and handles shutdown conditions and things of that nature. So the one change we're making here is using entry point rather than CMD. In a development environment, CMD may just be fine because you want to tweak the flags that you're calling your app with as you iterate on things. For example, set verbose options or debug options, for example. But for production use, you almost certainly want to use entry point.
Yeah, and I think that this one's starting to get into the realm of the pretty technical. I'll say I had to do some additional digging to try to better understand this one when we were working on the article. And I think we see when we get into some of the more advanced use cases too, that there are times when you would actually switch back to CMD, depending on if you're, I think, in a multi-stage build case and stuff like that. So it is one of those ones that chances are most developers aren't going to care about it too much. But if you're running something pretty simple like a Node.js app, then entry point's probably going to be better for you than CMD.
So we've got a couple of questions which are good to probably address at this point in the live chat. So Yannick says, how likely is it that a pinned version disappears from the repository? In my experience, almost never. I mean, Pieter, have you ever seen significant pinned versions disappearing?
Yeah, I haven't, and I'll say when you look at something like Node, and it's something we could maybe dive into at some point with the Slim developer platform, where you can kind of go back and look at version history and some of the different pinned versions. I don't think it happens very often. I definitely put the question out to the community and maybe some of the folks that we have in our Discord channel who work with containers in production all the time, about how often that happens. I haven't heard of it a ton. I do know that occasionally tags will change and stuff like that, which can throw people off. So a lot of times our developers are looking at the different digest values or the SHA values for each container, because those are unique to each container image. So that tends to be a little bit better way of doing version control at scale. But I think for the most part, you're right. I think people can rely on those
Yeah.
versions being available.
Yeah. And Yannick goes on to ask, so Docker creates a layer after each line in the Dockerfile. And you've already replied there and explained that new layers are created when the from command is used, or copy, or run. So that triggers new layers. And that's a good question to ask right now, because it segues neatly into this next point here about cleaning up cached files. So most package managers do have a means of cleaning up after themselves, and it's just the right thing to do. You can read the words on the article there for a metaphor as to why you would want to do this. So what's been changed here is this run command that does the npm CI concatenates the cache cleanup, and it does that in a single run command. Now, if you did that in 2 run commands, you wouldn't actually make your container any smaller, because you'd have a layer with the transient data inside it, and then a layer that removes that data, but ultimately it would still be there. So by using this run command that executes multiple statements, you end up with a layer that doesn't have the temporary data inside it. So it's a nice cleanup phase.
And I think one thing we mentioned that we're just using like this really simple hello world app example here, and this isn't going to do that much in like a hello world app in terms of container size. So if you're like comparing your 950 megabyte container to like just doing this command, it's going to be like 949 megabytes or something.
Right.
But if you had a full React app or something along those lines, then it's going to be you'll notice the size difference and the build time difference a lot more in doing this. So
yes, indeed. And it's interesting. So you've remembered well. So it's interesting that this tiny little application, the initial container that this creates, is approximately 950 megabytes, which is quite a lot of stuff inside it. And that's why we've been showing DockerSlim in prior live streams, because it helps take that 950 megabytes down to tens of megabytes to just keep what the application actually requires. So just to conclude on this, you can go a long way to slimming your container and optimizing your container just by good use of the Dockerfile itself. And we've outlined the very basics of how you can do that today. And we'll be looking at some more advanced techniques in upcoming live streams and articles on the Slim.AI website.
Yeah, I think the cool thing about this one and this exploration, for me at least, is that these things are kind of additive. So if you're building Dockerfile at home, you can just use this Dockerfile approach, and then when we get into the more advanced techniques, it'll carry through. It'll still help. You'll see increased gains and better security and smaller images and faster build times using any of those techniques. And then we'll kind of talk about how DockerSlim interacts with that, and how the Slim.AI toolset can interact with all of that. So.
Right. And Yannick says, thank you for the clarifications. I'm a Docker newbie. And that's one of the reasons why we've been doing this. Is it's surprising how many people are developing software the live long day, but containers are created by a separate part of the tech team, for example. So this is an opportunity to get started with creating Docker files, even if it's just for local development and iteration. But once you've got this far, then you can, start to introduce the additional techniques that we'll cover in the coming weeks in order to deliver a container to your ops team that will make them smile.
Yeah. I think it's pretty common. I'll be honest. I've been talking with a lot of the developers that I worked with at previous jobs and stuff, and almost all of them are using containers now. A
Hmm.
lot of them are really senior developers, but they say to me, like, oh, well, you know more about containers than we do right now, and I'm like, well, I haven't really been working with them for that long either, so yeah, I think that's common, and then I think people kind of like run into different issues. Like, there's a lot of good content out there on just like getting started, right?
Yeah.
But there's not a lot of great content there. Like, it's like, get started, be a super expert, and there's
Right.
not a lot of stuff in the middle. So I think that's what we're trying to do on this
Indeed.
live stream. So
Indeed. And if you are more familiar with Docker and you're looking to up your Docker's optimization game, then do head over to the DockerSlim site. You'll find the project on GitHub. It's all open source. It's chock full of examples there, and you'll find more on the Slim.AI blog as well, and through these live streams here and our YouTube channel. So if you want to go from 950 megabytes to 14, then head over to DockerSlim and check that stuff out as well. Right. Have you got anything else you want to touch on, or shall we wrap things up?
Yeah, I don't think so. I'm just excited to be doing this, and we'll have more examples coming up and more guests coming up as well. So
Right.
excited to dive into some other stuff and see Eric's been using Docker in both development and production, and I think we'll probably dive into some of that stuff too later. Our team's working on some integrations with Docker Compose, and that came out at DockerCon. That there's some improvements to Compose, and I know a lot of people are using that for kind of development environments and then production environments, and so I think that's a pretty interesting topic for us to explore.
So as we have people here who are learning the ropes with Docker, we should explain that Docker Compose is a way to define a multi-application app. So something that has, say, a database and an application, or a database and a backing store and an application. And what they announced at DockerCon last week is Docker Compose is no longer going to be a separate utility. It's going to be a function of Docker itself. Yes, Yannick, Bitwarden is a perfect example of where Docker Compose would shine, because I think they've got 10 or 12 microservices for the official Bitwarden infrastructure. Right. Well, we'll wrap it up there. Hopefully there was something useful there for you if you're new or not new to Docker. If you're not following here, please do. And also head to Slim.AI and get subscribed to the YouTube channel, where we're going to be putting up the backlog of all of this tomorrow. In fact, a whole bunch of stuff is going live tomorrow. So, thanks very much, Peter. I look forward to seeing you in the next one of these. And
Thank
for
you, Martin.
everyone that joined us, thanks for stopping by. I look forward to seeing you very soon.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Good being
Thanks
here
very
again.
much. Bye for now.